They lied to you. Your teachers lied to you. Don't get mad at me for exposing the truth. But the world's first great library wasn't Greek. It was African, long before Alexandria's marble pillars rose, before Aristotle was born, before a single scroll in Greece was written. Africa had already built a world of books, scholars, and science that the West later claimed as its own. But before you start crying about it, give me 30 seconds to explain. Let's start with the myth. They taught you that the Library of Alexandria was humanity's first light of knowledge, a Greek miracle of learning that sparked civilization. They told you that when it burned, the world fell into darkness. But that's only half the story. The truth is, Alexandria wasn't the beginning. It was the copy. Because before there was Alexandria, there was Timbuktu. Before the Greeks wrote about philosophy, Carthage was already writing about medicine, law, and astronomy. Before the Romans mapped the stars, Kushite scholars and Egyptian priests had already charted the heavens on temple walls. Africa didn't borrow civilization, it built it. And when the Greeks finally came, they didn't discover knowledge, they collected it. From African temples, libraries, and universities that had existed for centuries, they took what was written in Medu Neter, the language of the Nile, translated it into Greek, and called it the birth of philosophy. But the Nile had already given birth to wisdom, long before Greece even had a name. Let's go back, not to Athens, but to Kemet. Ancient Egypt wasn't just pyramids and tombs. It was a living university. The temples at Thebes, Heliopolis, and Memphis held archives so vast that priests trained for 40 years to read them. They wrote in papyrus scrolls that filled halls longer than modern libraries. Geometry, chemistry, anatomy, metaphysics, all recorded in ink thousands of years before Aristotle or Plato ever set foot on African soil. When Greek students came to Egypt, they came as learners, not teachers. Pythagoras, Plato, and even Solon studied under African priests. The Greeks themselves admitted it. They called Egypt the land of wisdom, and they called its priests the masters of the world's oldest science. So why don't we hear that in school? Because history was rewritten by the conquerors, the Romans, the Europeans, the colonizers, who needed Africa to look dark, illiterate, and primitive. They couldn't let the world know that the foundation of Western civilization rested on African scrolls, so they erased the sources and praised the students. By the time the Library of Alexandria was built in the 3rd century BC, Africa had already been archiving knowledge for millennia. Alexandria itself was built on Egyptian soil, funded by the gold labor and intellect of Africans. Its scribes were trained by Egyptian priests. Its architecture mirrored African temples. Its books were filled with African knowledge. And yet somehow, Europe claimed the credit. But Alexandria wasn't the only library they buried. Across the Sahara, thousands of miles away, another civilization rose. Timbuktu, the jewel of the Mali Empire. By the 13th century, Timbuktu had hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Astronomy, law, philosophy, poetry, mathematics. Students traveled from all over Africa, Arabia, and even Europe to study under its scholars. Its universities, Sankoré, Jingrabur, Sidi Yahya, were older than most European colleges that came later. When Europe was still burning witches for studying the stars, Timbuktu's scholars were mapping planetary orbits. When Europeans chained Africans on the coast, Timbuktu's librarians were binding books in gold. The manuscripts didn't vanish when the empires fell. Families hid them in clay walls, buried them in sand, and passed them down for generations. Some are still being uncovered today. Pages written in Arabic, Songhai, and Hausa, proof that Africa's legacy of science and literature was never primitive. It was global. But here's the most painful truth. When the French colonized West Africa, They burned and stole thousands of these manuscripts. They carted them away to museums and universities in Paris, London, Lisbon. And when European scholars found astronomy and geometry in African ink, they said, this must have been imported from the Arabs. They couldn't accept that black scholars wrote them centuries before European literacy even began. History became theft, polished and renamed. But the evidence never stopped whispering. Even today, the ruins of Carthage still bear the script of African mathematicians. The tombs of Egypt still preserve scrolls that describe brain surgery, planetary motion, and philosophy. And in Mali, the people still call their buried manuscripts the bones of the ancestors. You can burn a library, you can steal its scrolls, but you can't erase what's written in the memory of a continent. Because long before Greece dreamed of reason, Africa was already writing it. Long before Rome ruled the world, Africa taught it how. And long before Europe called itself civilized, Africa had already built the libraries that define civilization itself. The truth is simple and terrifying to those who built their power on lies. The great library of Africa didn't burn, it was buried, and now we're digging it back up. They called them temples, but they weren't temples. They were universities, the first the world had ever seen. When most of Europe still lived in tribes and oral tales, the Nile Valley was already a network of schools, each temple a library, each priest a professor. This was the world of Kemet, the Black Land, where knowledge was sacred and wisdom was the highest offering to the gods. And what they built there would echo across every civilization that followed. The temples at Heliopolis, Memphis, and Thebes weren't just houses of worship. They were archives of science, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Their walls weren't blank, they were textbooks carved in stone. Their hymns weren't just songs, they were coded formulas of chemistry, alchemy, and cosmology. Every prayer was a theorem, every ritual, an experiment. Here's the part that schoolbooks never told you. The priests of Egypt weren't mystics in robes waving incense. They were scientists, engineers, mathematicians, and philosophers, trained for decades in what they called the mystery schools. The mystery wasn't magic, it was knowledge, guarded, refined, and tested over thousands of years. Students studied for 40 years before they could teach. They learned geometry to map the earth, astronomy to track the Nile's floods, medicine to heal the sick with herbs and surgery. They recorded everything, on papyrus, in stone, in memory, and the rest of the world came knocking. Greek historians like Herodotus and Diodorus Siculus wrote that the Egyptians invented writing, science, and the calendar. Plato himself said that when he studied in Egypt, he met priests who had preserved wisdom for 9,000 years before his time. Think about that. Plato, the man they call the father of Western philosophy, learned from people who were already ancient when Greece was new. The Greeks didn't invent philosophy, they translated it. They took Egyptian theology and called it metaphysics. They took African ethics and called it moral philosophy. They took Matat, the African principle of truth, balance, and order, and renamed it justice. But back in Kemet, it wasn't about personal glory or conquest. Knowledge was divine. It wasn't meant to be owned. It was meant to keep the universe in harmony. The students of the temple universities weren't there for fame. They were there to uphold Matat, the truth that kept the sun rising and the river flowing. Every scroll they wrote, every carving they etched into limestone, was part of a promise to use knowledge to preserve life, not destroy it. When Egypt thrived, it wasn't just because of its armies or gold, it was because of its intellect. Its engineers aligned pyramids with the stars to a precision modern scientists still marvel at. Its doctors performed brain surgery, bone setting, and dental work documented in the Edwin Smith Papyrus, centuries before Hippocrates was born. Its astronomers charted the precession of equinoxes with such accuracy that NASA still uses their star maps as references. But then came the shift. As Egypt weakened under foreign rule, outsiders saw opportunity. The Persians came first, then the Greeks, and finally the Romans. Each one took a little more than land. They took knowledge, the one resource that made Africa unstoppable. When Alexander the Great marched into Egypt, he didn't conquer it, he was awed by it. He saw temples filled with scrolls, scholars and inventions beyond his world's imagination. And when he founded Alexandria, he wanted to capture that brilliance in stone. That's how the Library of Alexandria was born, not from Greek genius, but from African genius rebranded. It was built with Egyptian labor, funded by African wealth, and filled with African manuscripts. Greek scribes translated texts from hieroglyphs and Demotic into Greek, and then stamped their names on them. They called it preservation, but it was plagiarism. When European historians later called the Library of Alexandria the cradle of civilization, they conveniently skipped the part where it was literally built on African archives. They forgot that Alexandria stood on Kemet's ruins, that the marble foundation they praised was laid by the same people they enslaved centuries later. And yet the irony is poetic, because the very thing they tried to erase still survives. Even after the library burned, Egypt's knowledge lived on in temples hidden in the south, in Nubia, Meroe, and Kush, where black scholars preserved the teachings of Matat, while Europe descended into darkness. They carried that flame through the desert, across the Sahel, until it reached Mali, where the next chapter of Africa's libraries would rise again. And that's where the story turns. Because when the world forgot Egypt's wisdom, Africa remembered. When the Nile's northern kingdoms began to fade, the world thought the light of Egypt had gone out. But Africa doesn't let knowledge die. It moves it. And so, when the temples of Heliopolis and Thebes fell silent, the torch passed south, to the land the ancients called Kush. This was not a backup civilization. This was a continuation. The Kushites didn't just inherit Egypt's knowledge, they perfected it. At Napata, and later Meroe, the priests built new temples modeled after those of Kemet. But these weren't imitations, they were evolutions, blending Egypt's science with the innovation of sub-Saharan Africa. They developed their own script, the Meroitic language, one of the first written systems born entirely in Black Africa. They forged iron in quantities so vast that archaeologists still call Meroe the Birmingham of the ancient world. But beyond the metal and the monuments, it was the mindset they preserved. Where Egypt taught Maat, the balance of truth and order, Kush lived it. They ruled not through tyranny, but through wisdom carried down from the Nile's temples. And unlike Egypt, which grew divided under foreign rule, Kush remained defiantly African. They looked north and saw the conquerors rewriting history, chiseling away black faces from stone, and they swore never to forget. So when Egypt became a province under Greek control, the kingdom of Kush struck back. They marched north, driving invaders from Nubia. In one of the greatest reversals in ancient history, they even defeated the Roman legions at Qasr Ibrim and Syene. Their queen, the legendary Candace Amanarinas, led armies herself, blinding a Roman general in battle and negotiating peace on her own terms. Rome never forgot her name, but what matters most isn't the battles, it's what they defended. Because behind Kush's armies were schools, behind every Candace's crown was a library, and in those libraries were scrolls copied from Kemet's last temples, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, all written in ink on papyrus and parchment. The mystery schools of Egypt had become the academies of Nubia. Young scholars from across Africa came to study there, from Axum in Ethiopia, from Nok in Nigeria, from Carthage in North Africa. They came to learn from a civilization that had refused to die. But Africa wasn't done moving. Knowledge flows like a river, And when the Nile reached its southern deserts, it found new paths westward, through caravan trails, trade routes, and oral traditions. The teachings of Kemet and Kush spread across the Sahel. They followed the salt roads, the gold caravans, the pilgrims of faith and fortune, until they reached the heart of West Africa. And there, a new world began to rise. It wasn't a copy of Egypt or Kush. It was something uniquely African, a fusion of the Nile's science, Nubia's resilience, and the Sahel's rhythm. The kingdoms of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai would soon emerge, and within their walls, the next great African library would be born. But before we reach that golden age, we have to understand the bridge, the spiritual and intellectual bloodstream that connected the Nile to the Niger. Because what most historians don't tell you is this: when Egypt fell, Africa didn't lose knowledge, it decentralized it, it democratized it. It turned scholars into travelers and temples into caravans. They didn't bury their books, they carried them. Across dunes, through mountains, by camel, and by memory. The words of Kemet found new breath in the voices of griots, poets, and philosophers of the West. And that journey, that pilgrimage of wisdom, would ignite a flame that no empire could extinguish. The flame would burn brightest in Timbuktu, the city of light in the heart of the desert, a place where knowledge became wealth, and libraries became the new temples of Ma'at. That's where we're going next, because if you thought the Library of Alexandria was the crown jewel of the ancient world, you haven't seen what Africa built when the world stopped watching. When the world talks about the great cities of learning, Athens, Alexandria, Rome, they never mention Timbuktu. And that's not an accident, because for centuries, historians wanted you to believe that Africa's story was oral, primitive, and illiterate. But the desert wind still whispers the truth. Timbuktu was once the intellectual capital of the world, hidden in the heart of the Sahara, on the edge of the Niger River. Timbuktu was not a mirage, it was a miracle of the mind. Caravans arrived from every direction, from Morocco, Cairo, Kano, and even Andalusia, carrying salt, gold, and most importantly, books. Books bound in leather and parchment, filled with the words of philosophers, mathematicians, astronomers, and poets. Timbuktu wasn't just trading goods, it was trading ideas. At the city's core stood Sankoré University, founded in the 14th century, under the patronage of a wealthy woman known as Sankoré's Lady. Built of mud and sunlight, it became one of the world's first great universities, a vast network of scholars, libraries, and lecture halls connected across Mali's Golden Empire. Here, education wasn't a privilege, it was a duty. Children memorized the Quran, but also studied geometry, medicine, physics, and history. The professors were called Mo'allams, and the students came from across Africa and beyond, from Ghana, from Egypt, from Morocco, even from the Arabian Peninsula. Each student who graduated didn't receive a diploma, they received a library, stacks of manuscripts, handwritten by their own teachers, containing the wisdom of generations. Knowledge was the wealth of Timbuktu, and scholars were its kings. But it wasn't just Islamic texts that filled its shelves. Among those manuscripts were the echoes of Africa's oldest philosophies, remnants of Nile Valley science, Nubian astronomy, and ancient healing practices that predated Islam by millennia. Sankoré wasn't importing knowledge, it was preserving Africa's memory. And then came the Mali Empire, under Mansa Musa, whose pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 would change the world's perception of Africa forever. He didn't just travel with gold, he traveled with intellect. Hundreds of scholars, architects, and scribes joined his caravan. When he passed through Cairo, the markets trembled with gold. When he returned home, he turned his empire into the Renaissance, before the Renaissance. Under his rule, Timbuktu became a magnet for minds. He funded libraries, commissioned translations of Greek and Egyptian texts into Arabic, and turned the desert into a constellation of learning. He invited mathematicians from Cairo, poets from Andalusia, and astronomers from the Maghreb, but at the heart of it all were African scholars, trained in the traditions of the Nile. Names like Ahmed Baba, Mahmud Khati, and Abdurrahman al-Sadi became legends. They debated law, charted the stars, and wrote encyclopedias of medicine, centuries before Europe's universities could even imagine them. When European explorers finally reached Timbuktu in the 19th century, they expected to find a myth. Instead, they found a city where books were worth more than gold. But Europe wasn't ready for that truth. When French colonizers rediscovered Timbuktu, they didn't celebrate it, they plundered it. Thousands of manuscripts were stolen, burned, or buried. The narrative of African genius was silenced again, rewritten under the familiar excuse Africa had no written history. Yet even in silence, Timbuktu endured, because its people didn't store their knowledge in vaults, they stored it in memory. Families hid manuscripts beneath floorboards, wrapped in cloth, guarded like sacred relics. For centuries, in the heat and dust, the librarians of Timbuktu became guardians of Africa's truth. And when the world finally began to listen again, what they uncovered was staggering. Over 700,000 surviving manuscripts, written in Arabic, Ajami, and local African languages. Texts on medicine, physics, jurisprudence, mathematics, and philosophy, all created by African minds, centuries before the European Enlightenment. Every line, every faded word, is proof that Africa's genius didn't vanish when Alexandria burned. It moved, it transformed, it evolved. Timbuktu wasn't just a city, it was a statement, a declaration to the world that Africa didn't need to borrow civilization, it was civilization. And even now, as those manuscripts are slowly digitized and preserved, the story they tell remains the same. The great library of Africa never died, it was just waiting for the world to remember. They told you the Renaissance began in Florence. They told you that progress moved north from Greece to Rome, from Rome to Europe. But the truth is, while Europe was clawing its way out of the Dark Ages, Africa was already glowing in gold and genius. Because across the Sahara, three empires, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, weren't just trading salt and gold, they were trading knowledge. They built roads of intellect that stretched farther than any empire's reach. And at the center of it all stood a civilization that defied the myth of African silence. It began with Ghana, the land of gold. Its capital, Kumbi Sele, was a marvel. Twin cities joined by trade, filled with markets, mosques, and scholars. Arab chroniclers like al-Bakri wrote of its splendor, golden bracelets, jeweled horses, courts that gleamed beneath desert suns. The people of Ghana spoke with wisdom, governed with justice, and dealt in gold so pure it became legend. But when Mali rose from Ghana's ashes, the world would finally see Africa's true light. Mali, the empire of Musa, the empire of poets, architects, and philosophers. The empire where a man's wealth wasn't counted by the gold he owned, but by the knowledge he shared. From the Atlantic to the edge of the Sahara, Mali built a network of universities and mosques that rivaled anything in medieval Europe. And under Mansa Musa, Timbuktu became the crown, the Athens of Africa. But even Mali was only a chapter in a much larger book, because when Mali's time waned, Songhai rose, and with it, the greatest university system the ancient world had ever seen. Under the rule of Askia Muhammad the Great, Songhai turned Timbuktu, Gao and Jani into a triangle of enlightenment. He reformed government with scholars at its core, funding schools, medical institutions, and astronomical observatories. He built a government where intellect guided power, where law was written not by conquerors, but by thinkers. In Songhai's capital, Gaol, scholars discussed Aristotle, astronomy, and African metaphysics in the same breath. They debated the structure of the cosmos and the ethics of leadership, and their conclusions didn't stay in books. They shaped how cities were built, how justice was delivered, how people lived. Europe was still drawing maps based on myth. Songhai was drawing the stars, and through these networks of scholars, merchants, and travelers, Africa connected itself to the world. Caravans brought silk from China, spices from India, and manuscripts from Baghdad, all passing through African hands. In those bustling markets, you could buy salt, gold, and the latest philosophical text from Persia, all in the same breath. Timbuktu wasn't isolated. It was the center of gravity for global trade and thought. But what made this golden age so powerful wasn't just its wealth, it was its structure. These empires were built on systems of trust, law, and education that predated Europe's modern states. They had postal systems, organized taxation, and a class of civil servants, scholars trained to record history, manage trade, and interpret law. Their libraries weren't collections of trophies, they were living systems of memory, and at the root of it all was faith in knowledge. In these societies, ignorance wasn't a weakness, it was a sin, the greatest sin. A scholar in Timbuktu could rise higher than a warrior in battle. A man who could quote the stars was worth more than a man who could swing a sword. That's how much they valued thought. When the Spanish Inquisition was burning books in Europe, the scholars of Mali were copying them by hand, preserving the world's knowledge in the heart of Africa. When Europe was still arguing whether the Earth was flat, Songhai's astronomers had already charted planetary movement with mathematical precision. And when the Renaissance painters were rediscovering perspective, African architects were already building it, crafting mosques with geometric harmony and sound that amplified through perfect acoustic design. The desert wasn't empty, it was alive with light, a civilization of intellect that didn't need marble to prove its worth, only clay, ink, and the endless will to learn. But that brilliance, that golden rhythm of thought, couldn't stay untouched forever, because soon new forces would ride across the sands, not traders, but conquerors. And they didn't come for gold or salt, they came for the soul of Africa's knowledge. And when the smoke cleared, one of the greatest libraries in human history would be buried beneath dust and silence. They say when an old man dies in Africa, a library burns. But what happens when invaders set fire to the library itself? When the words, the wisdom, the memories of entire civilizations go up in smoke? That's not a metaphor. That's Timbuktu, 1591 AD. By then the city was the beating heart of African intellect, a sanctuary of scholars, poets, and philosophers. It wasn't just a city, it was a university that stretched across an empire. Every street held a classroom, every home a library. Over 700,000 manuscripts sat in private collections, books on astronomy, medicine, mathematics, law, and philosophy. Knowledge passed not through kings, but through scribes, teachers, and students who copied the world by candlelight. And then the Moroccans came. The Sultan of Morocco, Ahmad al-Mansur, wanted gold, but what he found was greater than gold. He found knowledge, and to him that was dangerous. The Moroccan army crossed the Sahara with muskets, horses, and greed. They arrived not as learners, but as conquerors. In 1591, they crushed the Songhai army at Tendebe, ending centuries of African sovereignty over the Sahara's trade. The libraries of Timbuktu, once the pride of the world, were now at the mercy of soldiers who couldn't read a word of what they destroyed. Fire spread through the manuscripts. Scholars were hunted. Those who resisted were executed or enslaved. Others buried their books in clay pots beneath the sand, whispering prayers that one day their words would rise again. Some packed what they could carry and fled east to Kano, west to Senegal, south to the Niger's bends, carrying Africa's wisdom, like refugees of memory. What Europe calls the scientific revolution was in truth the aftermath of a theft. While Africa's knowledge was burned and buried, its fragments were stolen, translated in secret, carried north through trade routes, and repackaged under foreign names. The manuscripts that survived reveal the truth. Africans had already charted the stars, diagnosed diseases, measured the earth, and calculated orbits centuries before Copernicus or Galileo. But the world forgot, or rather, it was taught to forget. European chroniclers called the Moroccan invasion civilization reclaiming Africa. They said the libraries were primitive, their scholars imitators. They described Timbuktu as a myth, a golden city of illusion, not intellect. But they were wrong, painfully wrong, because buried beneath that sand lay the real story, one that would outlast empires. Centuries later, in the 20th century, when archaeologists began uncovering manuscripts from Timbuktu's surviving families, they found books so advanced, they stunned historians. Books on surgery, algebra, optics, astronomy, agriculture, theology, and law. Manuscripts that predated Europe's Renaissance by hundreds of years. They realized Timbuktu wasn't just a place, it was a state of mind, an Africa that wrote its own destiny, in ink and light. Each page unearthed was a whisper from the past. They couldn't burn everything, and indeed they hadn't, because the descendants of those ancient scholars had done what no empire could have expected. They preserved their knowledge in secret. Families guarded books like bloodlines, passing them through generations, hidden in walls, under floors, inside trunks, sealed with wax. They risked their lives for words, because they knew, when knowledge dies, people follow. Even in flames, Timbuktu refused to vanish. Even in silence, it continued to teach. And that is the cruel irony of history. While Europe crowned itself as the birthplace of modern thought, it was standing on the ashes of African books. The fire that burned Timbuktu wasn't the end of knowledge, it was the transfer of it. Africa's intellect was smuggled, copied, disguised, but never destroyed. Every idea that lit Europe's enlightenment had already burned first in African hands. But the conquerors didn't just steal the words, they rewrote them. And soon they'd take the next step, not just erasing Africa's libraries, but erasing Africa's authorship. You've heard of Newton, Galileo, Copernicus, the fathers of science. But what if I told you that their father's father was African? No, not by blood, by borrowed brilliance, because long before Europe's Age of Reason, Africa had already reasoned it all out, and when the world came to plunder its gold, it quietly stole its genius too. Here's how the great rewrite began. When the Moroccan invaders sacked Timbuktu, they didn't understand what they were burning, but some among them recognized value. Bundles of manuscripts were seized and shipped north to Fez, Marrakesh, Cairo, and later Andalusia. Arab scholars, traders, and European diplomats got their hands on them, and slowly, the knowledge began to migrate, stripped of its origin. Libraries of Cordoba and Granada soon swelled with texts that were in truth the children of Timbuktu. Arabic translations of African astronomy and mathematics began circulating across the Mediterranean, finding their way into Italian, French, and Latin centuries later. But when European scholars encountered these works, they didn't see Africa, they saw opportunity, and they did what empires always do with the truth. They renamed it. A Malian equation became Arabic algebra. A Songhai star chart became Islamic astronomy. A manuscript on medicine from Gao became Middle Eastern healing philosophy. And when European universities finally got their hands on them, they became Western science. But let's pull the curtain back. In the archives of Spain and Portugal, researchers have uncovered 14th and 15th century notes describing astronomical calculations that predate Galileo by nearly 300 years. Some match diagrams, found in Timbuktu's surviving manuscripts, word for word, including notations on planetary motion and the elliptical paths of Mars. In one text, from the Ahmed Baba Institute, the African scholar Mahmoud Kadi described the wandering stars, moving not in circles, but in elongated paths, centuries before Kepler discovered it. Coincidence, or evidence of intellectual theft hidden under translation? And then there's the medicine. African physicians wrote entire treatises on surgery, childbirth, infectious disease, and herbal medicine, all meticulously catalogued. One manuscript, titled The Book of Healing, detailed 800 medical recipes using plants, minerals, and procedures still in use today. When these texts reached Europe, the authors' names disappeared. In their place, new ones appeared. Latinized, European, acceptable. Even Timbuktu's architecture inspired theft. The ribbed arches and geometric mosaics that later defined Moorish Spain, the Alhambra, the Great Mosque of Cordoba, were rooted in West African engineering. But as time passed, their origins blurred, and soon Europe claimed the credit for design born from African hands. And that's the sinister genius of colonial storytelling. They didn't just erase Africa, they absorbed it. They made its brilliance unrecognizable, rewriting it in their own tongue, until the world forgot who first spoke the words. By the 18th century, when Enlightenment thinkers began praising reason and progress, they were standing on African foundations, pretending they had laid the bricks themselves. When they studied Arabic mathematics, they didn't realize, or didn't want to admit, that the Arabic was African in origin. Every formula, every chart, every law of motion was a whisper from Timbuktu, speaking through stolen ink. And while Europe celebrated its rebirth, Africa was painted as dark, primitive, illiterate. A continent once full of books was now depicted as a place of silence. But history is stubborn, and paper, the same paper they burned, still remembers. Today, as historians unearth more Timbuktu manuscripts, the pattern becomes undeniable. Africa's knowledge wasn't lost, it was laundered, scrubbed of its authors, renamed in foreign tongues, reissued under new banners. And the most painful part, the world applauded the thieves, not the thinkers. But the reckoning is here, because every rediscovered page, every restored manuscript, every scholar who dares to read between the lies, brings us closer to a truth Europe spent centuries burying. The Renaissance wasn't born in Florence, it was resurrected from the ashes of Africa. When the libraries fell, the flames didn't consume everything, not completely, because what the invaders didn't understand was that in Africa, knowledge wasn't just written on paper, it was written into people. When manuscripts turned to ash, the scholars turned to memory. Entire families, griots, imams, scribes, and poets became living archives, carrying the words of Timbuktu on their tongues and in their bloodlines. They didn't see themselves as historians. They were guardians of continuity, preserving the wisdom of their ancestors, the same way the Nile preserved the soil of Egypt, by flowing endlessly, even after the floods. In Mali, after the Moroccan invasion, surviving scholars from Sankoré University scattered across the Sahel to Gao, Jin, and Kano. Each carried a handful of manuscripts and a head full of knowledge. They hid pages inside clay pots, buried scrolls beneath homes, and recited passages aloud to students by candlelight, night after night. They knew that as long as one person remembered, the library still lived. In families across West Africa, ilm, knowledge, became inheritance. A father didn't pass his son gold, he passed him verses. A mother didn't give her daughter jewels, she gave her proverbs. And in those proverbs were fragments of astronomy, medicine, philosophy, the remains of Timbuktu's light disguised as oral tradition. It's why so many West African folktales carry coded layers. Stories about talking animals weren't just entertainment, they were allegories for ethics, trade, and natural science. When griots sang of kings who measured the stars, they weren't inventing myths. They were describing actual scholars who once mapped the heavens from the Niger's edge. Even centuries later, during the transatlantic slave trade, that oral lineage survived. Enslaved Africans carried their stories, their encoded knowledge, across the ocean, to the plantations of the Caribbean, to Brazil, to the American South. There, those same rhythms, cadences, and patterns re-emerged in songs of sorrow and resistance. Hidden inside spirituals and drum patterns were memories of mathematics, of cosmology, of systems of balance, because culture, like energy, cannot be destroyed, it only transforms. And while Europe printed books and claimed invention, Africa whispered its truth through generations. You see it in the griots of Mali, who can recite family lineages 800 years deep. You see it in Yoruba priests, who preserved complex divination systems that mirror binary code. You see it in the Dogon people, whose astronomical knowledge of the Sirius star system baffled modern scientists, because they remembered what others had written down and lost. That's the quiet defiance of African intellect. It doesn't die in conquest. It adapts. It hides inside rhythm, inside art, inside ritual. It waits, and that waiting paid off, because centuries after the fires of Timbuktu, when colonial explorers arrived in Africa, they expected to find silence, but they found echoes. They found people quoting geometry without parchment, describing planetary cycles without telescopes, practicing medicine without universities. They found a continent that had preserved what Europe thought it had destroyed. But those explorers didn't celebrate it. They dismissed it. They wrote in their journals, primitive magic, tribal superstition, unscientific, because they couldn't fathom that the villagers before them were the descendants of astronomers, physicians, and philosophers who once taught the world how to think. Even now, when historians uncover the same principles written in Timbuktu's pages and still practiced in rural Mali, they realize the truth. The library was never lost. It was disguised as life itself. Africa's scholars didn't need marble halls or glass cases to preserve their legacy. They built their libraries in living hearts, and those hearts kept beating, even through slavery, colonization, and erasure. Today, when we listen to a griot sing, or a priest divine, or a grandmother recite an ancient proverb, we are hearing the echo of a burned library that refused to stay silent. Because history isn't what survives on paper. History is what refuses to die. When European powers began their so-called Age of Discovery, they didn't just sail to new lands, they sailed into denial. They saw the remnants of Africa's ancient intellect and realized something dangerous. The foundation of their world wasn't European at all. The first explorers who reached West Africa were stunned. They expected naked savages, but instead found cities with universities, hospitals, libraries, and organized trade systems. Timbuktu's Sankoré complex could house 25,000 students, more than Oxford at the time. Its scholars wrote in mathematics, law, medicine, astronomy, and theology, fields Europe still struggled to master. The Portuguese wrote letters home describing cities paved with stone and markets overflowing with gold, ivory, and knowledge. But when they returned, those accounts were quietly locked away, because if the public knew that Africa was educated and sophisticated, how could they justify enslaving its people? So Europe rewrote the story. They changed Africa, the cradle of civilization, into Africa, the dark continent. They painted explorers as heroes discovering lands already mapped by Africans for centuries. They made maps that erased African scholars and replaced them with empty deserts and tribal zones. Even their art followed the lie, depicting Africans as laborers, never as architects or philosophers. When colonizers raided Timbuktu and other West African centers, they didn't just take gold, they took manuscripts. Thousands of books were shipped to Paris, London, and Lisbon. The ones they couldn't carry, they burned. And those they kept were reclassified, their origins hidden, their authors erased. European scholars translated the texts, but credited them to anonymous Arab or Mediterranean sources. Anything to separate Africa from brilliance. Then came the 19th century, the era of scientific racism. European academics invented new fields, like ethnology and craniometry, claiming that Africans were intellectually inferior. The irony, the same institutions making those claims had African manuscripts locked in their basements, documents filled with geometry, medicine, and philosophy, older than the universities that denied their existence. When Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798, his scholars cataloged everything. They documented temples, pyramids, and papyri, and they noticed something uncomfortable. The statues had African features. The texts praised Nubian gods. Even Herodotus, the Greek historian, had written centuries before that the Egyptians were black-skinned with woolly hair. So what did Napoleon's men do? They buried the reports. They published drawings that whitened the faces. They photographed statues from angles that hid their features. History was bleached, and that whitewashing became policy. European education systems began teaching that civilization was born in Greece and Rome, as if Africa had been an empty spectator to its own genius. They built museums where African artifacts were displayed without names, without credit, without context, stripped of their humanity, just like their descendants were stripped of theirs in chains. Even today, universities in Europe and America quietly hold African manuscripts in special collections. They're labeled as Arabic or Islamic works, though their ink, script, and authorship trace back to the heart of Mali and Songhai. Hundreds of thousands of documents, medical treatises, trade records, philosophical texts, still sit untranslated, gathering dust in colonial archives. But the truth is resurfacing. African scholars, historians, and archaeologists are piecing the fragments back together. The manuscripts of Timbuktu are being digitized, restored, and reclaimed by their rightful descendants. What colonizers tried to erase, technology is now reviving. Every scanned page is a resurrection, every translation a form of rebellion. Because when the world finally reads what those pages contain, it won't just rewrite African history, it will rewrite human history. The timeline collapses, the hierarchy dissolves. We stop seeing Africa as a continent that was discovered and start recognizing it as the continent that discovered itself long before Europe ever looked outward. That's why the erasure was so vicious, because once you accept that Africa birthed science, medicine, and philosophy, you also have to accept that Europe's Enlightenment was a late echo of African light. And that truth is harder to face than any empire's fall. When the fires of conquest swept through West Africa, the conquerors thought they had burned the evidence of Africa's brilliance forever. But they were wrong, because the manuscripts didn't all burn. Some survived hidden away by hands that refused to let history die. When the Moroccan army invaded the Songhai Empire in 1591, their soldiers plundered everything they could find: gold, salt, ivory, books, especially the books. They set libraries ablaze, tore through the universities of Timbuktu, Gao, and Janneh, and bragged that they had silenced Africa's scholars. But what they didn't know was that before the soldiers arrived, the people had already moved the knowledge. Families, scholars, and students smuggled thousands of manuscripts out of the cities, hiding them in walls, caves, and desert caravans. They packed them in wooden chests, wrapped in leather and palm leaves, buried them beneath homes, and carried them on camelback across the Sahara. Entire villages became secret libraries. Knowledge became contraband, and every book was guarded like gold. For centuries, these manuscripts passed quietly from generation to generation. They weren't stored in cathedrals or universities. They were kept in homes. In clay rooms under the sand, inside family trunks, beneath floorboards, protected by faith and secrecy. Each page held centuries of study: astronomy, mathematics, medicine, poetry, ethics, trade, and law, all written in Arabic, Ajami, and local scripts. Some described how to map the stars, others how to heal with herbs or calculate distances by celestial movement. The manuscripts of Timbuktu weren't relics, they were records of a living civilization. Even under colonial rule, the families never revealed where their manuscripts were hidden. When French officials came in the late 1800s, demanding that native texts be sent to Europe, the locals smiled, nodded, and lied. They handed over copies or empty scrolls, keeping the real treasures buried where no colonizer would look, because they knew what those books meant. They weren't just ink on parchment, they were proof that Africa had universities when Europe was still learning to read its own alphabet. Proof that African scholars debated medicine, ethics, and astronomy, while Europe's universities were still arguing about whether the Earth revolved around the sun. By the 20th century, whispers of these hidden archives began to spread again. Colonial administrators heard rumors of entire libraries buried beneath the Sahel sands. European academics called them myths. But in 1964, in the newly independent nation of Mali, something extraordinary happened. A man named Ahmed Baba Institute was founded in Timbuktu, named after the great 16th century scholar Ahmed Baba, who had once written more than 40 books and been exiled by Moroccan invaders. The institute began collecting, preserving, and cataloging the surviving manuscripts. What they found shattered the myth of Africa's oral-only history. Over 700,000 manuscripts surfaced, from private homes, old mosques, and family chests. Some were over 800 years old, and they weren't crude or primitive. They were masterpieces of calligraphy, logic, and art. One manuscript explained how to calculate planetary orbits. Another detailed the ethics of leadership, centuries before Machiavelli. Others described the rights of women in marriage, the proper treatment of animals, and the trade routes connecting Africa to Asia and the Americas. This was not a continent in darkness. This was a continent that had once lit the world. But even as these treasures were being rediscovered, danger returned. In 2012, when extremist militants invaded Timbuktu, they threatened to burn the libraries again. The world watched in horror, believing that Africa's legacy would be turned to ash once more. But history repeated itself, and so did its defiance. A secret network of librarians and locals, led by men like Abdelkader Haidara, moved over 350,000 manuscripts out of Timbuktu. They loaded them onto boats, donkeys, and trucks, smuggling them through enemy lines under cover of night. They risked their lives for parchment, because those books weren't just stories, they were memory, they were identity. And for the people of Mali, protecting knowledge was a sacred duty. Today, those manuscripts are being restored, digitized, and read again by the descendants of the same scholars who first wrote them. Each restored page is an act of resistance, each translation, a resurrection. The world is beginning to see what Africa has always known. You can burn libraries, but you can't burn memory. You can bury books, but you can't bury truth. Because knowledge, once written, finds its way home. Before Europe had universities, Africa had Timbuktu, Djenné, Kano, and Gao, cities whose names echoed like beacons across the desert winds. This wasn't legend. This was an era when Africa taught the world how to think. From the 13th to the 16th century, West Africa became the intellectual capital of the planet. The University of Sankoré, in Timbuktu alone, housed over 25,000 students, more than most European universities at the time, and its curriculum. It didn't stop at religion. Students studied astronomy, medicine, geometry, chemistry, philosophy, law, and even finance. Graduates could read and write in multiple languages, debate theology in Arabic, and calculate planetary movements with mathematical precision. These weren't just scholars, they were innovators. African astronomers mapped the heavens with such accuracy that centuries later, when European explorers arrived, they used African charts to navigate the stars. Physicians in Timbuktu studied anatomy through dissection, identified diseases, and prescribed herbal treatments that modern science still recognizes today. Economists documented trade principles that predicted inflation and market cycles hundreds of years before Adam Smith. The manuscripts of Timbuktu captured all of this. They reveal a society obsessed with the pursuit of truth, governed by ethics, and structured around learning. At its heart was an unshakable belief: knowledge was divine. To learn was to serve God. To teach was to preserve creation. This was the same spirit that fueled the Mali and Songhai empires, the same spirit that made Mansa Musa invest in education as deeply as he did in gold. When Musa built mosques and universities, he wasn't importing foreign wisdom, he was exporting African genius. Pilgrims from Cairo, Baghdad, and Andalusia traveled thousands of miles to study under African teachers. They returned home, carrying ideas, equations, and philosophies that would later ignite Europe's Renaissance. Let that sink in. Africa wasn't borrowing civilization, it was lending it. The city of Timbuktu itself was a marvel of design, its architecture blending Sahelian clay with Arab arches, its streets lined with libraries, its markets bustling with scholars and merchants exchanging both goods and ideas. In the evenings, students would gather beneath oil lamps, reading aloud from scrolls written centuries before, debating ethics, politics, and science deep into the night. There was no divide between faith and reason here. Both were part of the same truth. Even in medicine, Africa led the way. Timbuktu doctors practiced early surgery, using antiseptic herbs to clean wounds and prevent infection. They developed surgical tools, studied mental health, and even wrote about the importance of hygiene long before such practices reached Europe. One manuscript described the circulation of blood centuries before William Harvey's discovery in England. Africa's scholars didn't just study, they corresponded with the world. Letters from Timbuktu have been found in Cairo, Mecca, Morocco, and even Istanbul. They discussed trade, mathematics, law, and philosophy, creating a global network of thought that stretched across continents. And yet, despite all this brilliance, when the story of human progress was rewritten in Europe, Timbuktu became a joke. They turned its name into a punchline, a symbol of remoteness and mystery, because the truth was too heavy to carry, that long before the Age of Enlightenment, there had already been an age of illumination, and it began in Africa. The Renaissance didn't just appear from thin air. It was sparked by the knowledge carried from African libraries to European shores. Scholars fleeing the fall of the Songhai Empire brought their books with them, books that contained the mathematical and philosophical foundations of the world we live in now. But history doesn't erase truth, it just hides it until someone dares to look. And when you look closely enough, you can see the fingerprints of Africa on everything that came after. In the geometry of cathedrals, in the medical texts of the Middle Ages, in the philosophy of reason that powered the Enlightenment. The irony: Europe spent centuries calling Africa dark, but while Europe was stumbling through its own shadows, Africa was building the libraries that would one day light its way. This was the golden age of knowledge, when the Sahara wasn't a barrier but a bridge, and the continent they called primitive was in truth the university of the ancient world. When Europe finally rediscovered Africa's brilliance, it didn't come with admiration, it came with greed. Colonizers arrived with ships, guns, and flags, not to learn, but to take. And what they couldn't steal, they rebranded. They claimed inventions that weren't theirs, buried manuscripts that didn't fit their narrative, and built museums filled with treasures stripped of their origins. They called it exploration, but it was extraction of gold, ivory, and ideas. By the late 1400s, European travelers began hearing whispers of Timbuktu, the city of scholars and wealth. They spoke of markets flowing with gold and libraries filled with secrets of the stars. When explorers like Leo Africanus visited, they were stunned. He described cities cleaner, more advanced, and more literate than any in Europe. But when his writings reached European courts, something strange happened. The truth was edited. Africa couldn't be seen as a land of light, so they turned its scholars into curiosities, its kings into myths, its libraries into legends. Then came the missionaries and colonial administrators. They arrived carrying Bibles and civilization, but their real mission was erasure. They shut down African schools, burned manuscripts, and replaced them with Western textbooks that claimed all knowledge began in Greece and ended in Europe. The great libraries of Africa, Timbuktu, Gao, Guinea, were silenced under the weight of colonial ignorance. Some manuscripts were stolen, others destroyed, many hidden away by families who refused to let history vanish. In dusty attics and clay vaults, Africans risked their lives to protect their ancestors' knowledge from European collectors. Today, thousands of those manuscripts still survive because ordinary people understood their value long before the world did. And what was inside those pages? Mathematics that predated Newton, astronomy that rivaled Copernicus, medicine that healed long before modern hospitals, blueprints of irrigation systems, calendars, trade maps, records of a civilization that mastered logic, art, and science, while Europe was still clawing out of the Middle Ages. But here's the twist. When those manuscripts were later rediscovered by European scholars, they didn't deny their brilliance, they rebranded it. African discoveries were renamed, reframed, and attributed to Arab or Mediterranean thinkers, as if Black Africa couldn't possibly have been the origin of genius. When African scholars wrote in Arabic, colonizers claimed the knowledge was Islamic. When they wrote in local tongues, it was dismissed as folklore. They created a historical no-man's land, where Africa existed only as a backdrop, never as the source. Even architecture wasn't spared. Structures like the Great Mosque of Djenné, built with perfect geometric harmony, were called influenced by outsiders. The irrigation systems of the Sahel were said to have foreign engineering roots. Every masterpiece had to be explained away, because accepting African genius meant shattering Europe's fragile myth of superiority, and that myth was essential. The entire justification for slavery, colonization, and conquest depended on the lie that Africa was a dark, empty continent waiting to be civilized. But the truth is, by the time Europeans set foot on African soil, Africa had already built empires, written laws, and charted the stars. It was Europe that was catching up. When the British and French occupied West Africa in the 19th century, they didn't just take land, they took identity. Artifacts from Timbuktu and Benin were displayed in London and Paris under false labels. Mali's manuscripts were boxed up, hidden in archives, or studied in silence. Generations grew up never knowing that their ancestors had once been the teachers of the world. The theft wasn't just physical, it was psychological. To dominate a people, you must first destroy their memory. If Africans forgot they had built the first universities, mapped the stars, and measured the earth, then they could be convinced that progress had to come from somewhere else, from Europe, from colonizers, from their oppressors. And that's exactly what happened. But like the buried scrolls of Timbuktu, truth can't stay hidden forever. Every manuscript that resurfaces, every artifact that's returned, every document translated, is a crack in the colonial narrative. And through those cracks, the light of Africa's forgotten brilliance shines again. Because history doesn't die, it waits. And as the truth returns, it asks a powerful question. If Africa was the foundation of knowledge, what else have they hidden? They tried to burn Africa's books, but Africa hid them. When colonial armies stormed through Mali, Niger, and Senegal, they didn't just plunder gold, they hunted for the manuscripts. To the invaders, those scrolls weren't relics, they were evidence, proof that Africans didn't just trade with the world, they taught it. But what they didn't expect was that the keepers of these books were already one step ahead. Families in Timbuktu, Gao, and Jenne, ordinary farmers, scholars, and merchants, gathered their libraries and buried them beneath homes, inside mud walls, and under the desert sand. They called themselves the Guardians. They weren't soldiers, they didn't have weapons, but they were fighting a war, one of memory against oblivion. Generations passed, and the manuscripts stayed hidden. Through centuries of colonization, world wars, coups, and drought, the scrolls survived in silence. Ink faded, pages yellowed, but the words, the wisdom, remained intact. And then, almost 1,000 years after they were written, the world rediscovered them. When scholars finally opened the libraries of Timbuktu, they expected superstition and myth. What they found instead was an intellectual powerhouse. Thousands upon thousands of manuscripts on mathematics, law, medicine, astronomy, architecture, geography, and philosophy. Every subject Europe claimed to have invented had already been mastered here. There were calculations for planetary motion, centuries before Kepler, diagrams of blood circulation, before Harvey, debates on ethics, governance, and economics that rivaled Aristotle and Plato. This wasn't a primitive society, it was a university of empires. The scribes of Timbuktu wrote in Arabic, Songhai, and Ajami, African languages in Arabic script, layering knowledge with poetry and rhythm. Each scroll was a collaboration between scholar and student, copied and improved across generations. Learning wasn't static, it was alive, breathing, evolving, and the libraries themselves weren't built for glory, they were built for legacy. You can still see the fingerprints of those scribes pressed into the corners of the pages, smudges of ink, from hands that knew their work mattered. They wrote not for kings or conquerors, but for the future, because they understood something the colonizers never did. Power fades, knowledge lasts. But when the manuscripts resurfaced in the 20th century, the reaction wasn't celebration, it was suspicion. Western scholars didn't believe Africans could have written them. Some claimed the scrolls were imported from the Arab world. Others said Africans couldn't have produced such scientific complexity, because to acknowledge their authenticity would mean rewriting world history again. But the evidence was undeniable. The calligraphy was local. The ink came from native plants. The bindings used Sahelian leather. These weren't foreign imports. They were born of African soil, African intellect, African genius. And still, even after the truth surfaced, the danger remained. When militants invaded Timbuktu in 2012, they burned buildings, smashed monuments, and tried to destroy the manuscripts once again. But just like before, Africa refused to forget. Thousands of volunteers and curators smuggled the scrolls out of the city in rice sacks, on donkey carts, across the desert at night. They hid them in caves and safe houses, risking their lives for pages of paper. Because to them, those words weren't relics, they were ancestors. Every scroll was a heartbeat of the continent's memory, and when the fires died and the dust settled, the scrolls survived again. They always do. Today, restoration centers in Bamako and Timbuktu are carefully digitizing each page, bringing Africa's lost libraries back to life. And as the words reappear on screens across the world, one truth becomes impossible to deny. Africa didn't need to be taught civilization, it taught civilization. The guardians of Timbuktu never called themselves heroes. They simply believed that the truth was worth saving. And because of them, the world can now read what Europe tried to erase. Thousands of books written by black scholars, centuries before the printing press, medicine, poetry, physics, law, all from the heart of Africa. This wasn't the continent Europe described. It was the cradle of thought, the library of the ancient world. And the question still echoes across the sands of Mali. If this is what survived, what else have they buried? They thought they buried Africa's mind forever, but the dust didn't cover it, it preserved it. The same deserts that once swallowed caravans now give back what they protected, the wisdom of a civilization that refused to die. And what's happening right now, in Timbuktu, in Ghana, in Ethiopia, in the diaspora, isn't nostalgia, it's a resurrection. Because for centuries, they told us Africa was a blank page, that it had no written history, no science, no philosophy, only rhythm, dust and darkness. But when the manuscripts re-emerged, that myth began to crumble, word by word, page by page. In the laboratories of Bamako, curators worked by candlelight to clean and scan thousands of ancient texts. You can hear the hum of old machines, the faint scratch of brushes lifting centuries of sand from the pages. Each restored book feels like a pulse returning to the body. The words once whispered in desert classrooms are being read again by students in New York, Lagos, and Paris. They lied to you. They said Europe brought the light to Africa. But these books show that Africa was the light, long before anyone else claimed to carry it. These aren't stories of superstition, they're treatises on algebra, optics, medicine, governance, and ethics. One scroll explains how to calculate the curvature of the earth using the stars. Another describes the movement of water through the body with precision that anticipates modern anatomy. And dozens more debate morality, time, and the nature of justice, proving that African philosophy wasn't primitive, it was profound. The manuscripts of Timbuktu are now recognized by UNESCO as treasures of humanity. But to those who protected them, they were never relics. They were instructions, guides for living with dignity, for learning, for questioning the world. And now as the digital archives grow, the descendants of those same scholars are beginning to read their ancestors' handwriting again and reclaim what was stolen. In classrooms across Mali and Senegal, children are learning that their great-grandfathers wrote the books Europe claimed to invent. In universities across Africa and the diaspora, historians are uncovering the connections between Timbuktu's libraries and other ancient centers, Alexandria, Axum, Kush, Benin. Because this wasn't an isolated miracle, it was a network, a web of learning that stretched across deserts and seas, linking Africa to Arabia, Asia, and even early Europe. The truth is, the Library of Africa never vanished. It just went underground, waiting for the world to be ready to listen again. And now that time has come. The rediscovery of Timbuktu's manuscripts isn't just about dusty pages or broken bindings. It's about what they represent, a new dawn in how we understand human civilization. Because when you hold one of those scrolls, you're holding the evidence that Africa didn't just witness history, it wrote it. And that changes everything. Imagine if schoolbooks showed children that Africa was mapping the stars while Europe was still lighting torches. Imagine if the story of civilization began not in Athens or Rome, but along the Niger River. Imagine what would happen if a generation grew up knowing the truth, that the foundations of science, art, and thought don't belong to a single continent, they belong to humanity. And Africa was the first author. The day the manuscripts were rediscovered, an old Malian librarian reportedly said, "They took our gold, but they left our words, and our words are worth more." He was right, because gold fades, empires fall, but knowledge, real knowledge, endures. It crosses centuries, survives fire, and whispers its way back through the cracks of time. And now that the truth is out, the question isn't whether the world will listen, it's whether the world will finally learn. The Library of Africa still breathes, its pages turn again, and in every word, every faded line of ink, Africa speaks, not as the world's forgotten past, but as its eternal beginning.